The moment my husband pointed at the front door and told me to apologize or leave, everyone in the room smiled, because they thought they already knew how the night would end. They expected tears. They expected me to beg for another chance. Instead, less than 48 hours later, my 3-year-old son and I were sitting on a plane with 2 one-way tickets. By the time my husband and his family realized we were gone, there was nothing they could do to stop us. If they had known what I had secretly been planning for months, they never would have given me that ultimatum. My name is Rachel Brooks, and until recently I believed that patience could save any marriage. I had spent almost 6 years convincing myself that every insult from my husband's family was only temporary. I kept believing that one day Nathan would finally stand beside me instead of standing silently behind his parents. Looking back now, I realize I was not fighting to save my marriage. I was fighting an impossible battle for respect in a family that had already decided I would never belong. The hardest part was knowing our little boy, Caleb, was growing up watching everything happen. Nathan was not a cruel man when we first met. He was thoughtful, hardworking, and always knew how to make me laugh after a difficult day. During our first 2 years together, life felt almost perfect. We rented a tiny apartment, worked long hours, and dreamed about buying our first home. Whenever his parents visited, they seemed kind enough, although I noticed his mother, Margaret Brooks, always found small ways to remind me that I was not raised the way their family expected. At the time I brushed those comments aside because I believed every family needed time to adjust to a new member. Everything changed after our wedding. Margaret no longer hid her opinions behind polite smiles. She criticized my cooking, questioned my education, complained about the way I decorated our home, and even corrected the way I folded laundry. Nothing I did was ever good enough. If dinner tasted perfect, she said the portions were too small. If the house was spotless, she pointed out a dusty picture frame. Every visit left me emotionally exhausted. Yet Nathan always asked me to ignore her because confronting his mother would only create more problems. For a long time I listened to him. I convinced myself that keeping the peace mattered more than defending my pride. I smiled through awkward dinners and laughed at jokes that were clearly meant to embarrass me. Every family holiday became another performance where I pretended everything was fine while quietly counting the hours until we could leave. The strange part was that Nathan genuinely believed his mother's behavior was normal. He had grown up watching everyone accommodate her demands, so he never questioned them. He simply expected me to do the same. When Caleb was born, I hoped becoming grandparents would soften Nathan's parents. Instead, they became even more controlling. Margaret criticized everything from the clothes I bought for Caleb to the meals I prepared for him. She insisted I was spoiling him by reading bedtime stories every night and accused me of making him too dependent on me. Whenever Caleb reached for me instead of her, she joked that I was keeping him away from his real family. Those words hurt more than she could ever imagine, because I had always wanted Caleb to grow up surrounded by love, not competition. Nathan received a promotion at work shortly before Caleb turned 3. His salary nearly doubled, and everyone congratulated him for his success. I was proud of him because I knew how hard he had worked. Unfortunately, Margaret acted as though the promotion belonged to her. Every family dinner became another speech about the sacrifices she had made while raising Nathan. She reminded everyone that without her guidance he never would have become successful. Whenever someone complimented the life we had built together, she immediately redirected the credit back to herself. I rarely received so much as a polite acknowledgement. Around that time, I quietly returned to freelance graphic design, while Caleb attended preschool a few mornings each week. The extra income allowed me to build a small savings account that Nathan knew nothing about. I never intended to hide money from my husband, but something deep inside me kept whispering that one day I need a safety net. I could not explain why I felt that way. I simply knew I could not continue depending entirely on someone who refused to defend me whenever his family crossed the line. The final months before everything collapsed were the hardest. Margaret called almost every day with another request or another complaint. She expected us to spend nearly every weekend at their house. If we declined because Nathan wanted to rest or because Caleb had a fever, she accused me of manipulating her son. Nathan hated the constant arguments, but instead of standing up to her, he usually asked me to apologize just to keep everyone happy. Every apology felt like another piece of myself disappearing. One evening, after another exhausting dinner with his parents, I asked Nathan a simple question while Caleb slept upstairs. I wanted to know whether there would ever come a day when he chose our family before pleasing his parents. He stared at the floor for several seconds before quietly saying he did not want to choose between the people he loved. His answer broke my heart because I realized he did not understand that by refusing to choose, he had already made his decision. Every moment of silence was another vote against our marriage. A week later, Margaret announced that the entire family would gather to celebrate Thomas Brooks' 65th birthday. More than 30 relatives were invited, including cousins, uncles, aunts, neighbors, and longtime family friends. She specifically asked me to prepare my homemade apple pie because everyone supposedly loved it. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Maybe this dinner would finally be different. Maybe she truly wanted peace between us. I spent nearly an entire day preparing that dessert. Caleb helped sprinkle cinnamon over the apples, while laughing every time flour landed on his tiny nose. Watching him smile reminded me why I kept trying so hard. I wanted him to grow up believing families could forgive each other and become stronger after difficult moments. I had no idea that pie would become the beginning of the worst night of my life. The afternoon of Thomas' birthday arrived with bright sunshine and perfect weather, but from the moment we pulled into the driveway, I felt uneasy. Luxury cars lined both sides of the street, children played in the backyard, and laughter echoed through the open windows. Nathan squeezed my hand and quietly told me everything would be fine. I wanted to believe him. Carrying my homemade apple pie into the house, I smiled politely as relatives greeted us. Caleb immediately ran outside to play with his cousins, completely unaware that the next few hours would change our lives forever. Margaret welcomed everyone with her usual confidence, making sure every guest admired the decorations she had spent weeks planning. She accepted my dessert without even looking at it and placed it on the kitchen counter. Throughout the afternoon, she ignored me while praising everyone else. I tried not to let it bother me because I refused to ruin Thomas' celebration. Instead, I helped prepare drinks, served food, cleaned empty plates, and made sure Caleb was comfortable. Several relatives thanked me for helping, and for a brief moment, I thought the evening might finally end peacefully. Dinner was almost over when Margaret carried my apple pie into the dining room. I noticed the strange smile on her face before she even spoke. Standing in front of more than 30 people, she laughed and said she hoped everyone had eaten enough because the dessert certainly would not make anyone ask for a second slice. A few relatives chuckled politely, but she continued. She claimed the pie looked dry, uneven, and unworthy of a family celebration. Every sentence became louder than the one before, and soon the entire table was staring at me. I took a slow breath and calmly explained that if she disliked it, nobody had to eat it. My voice remained respectful because I refused to argue in front of Caleb. Instead of ending the conversation, Margaret accused me of being disrespectful for answering back. One cousin joined her, followed by another aunt who suggested I had always been too sensitive. The room quickly filled with uncomfortable laughter. I searched for Nathan, hoping he would finally put an end to the humiliation. Instead, he slowly stood from his chair and looked directly at me. His words still echo in my mind. He said that if I truly loved him, I would apologize to his mother immediately for embarrassing the family. Then he pointed toward the front door and calmly added that if I refused, I could leave. The silence that followed felt endless. Every face around the table watched me, expecting tears or another apology. Even Caleb stopped playing and looked at me with confused eyes. In that moment I realized something heartbreaking. My husband was not protecting his family from conflict. He was sacrificing his own wife to avoid disappointing his mother. I looked at Nathan for several seconds before quietly thanking everyone for dinner. Without raising my voice, I walked outside, buckled Caleb into his car seat, and drove home. During the drive, he asked why everyone seemed angry. I smiled through tears and simply told him that sometimes adults forget how to treat each other kindly. That night, after putting him to bed, I sat alone in the living room until sunrise. Every painful memory from the past 6 years replayed in my mind. By morning, my decision had been made. Nathan did not return home until the following afternoon. He expected another argument, followed by another apology, because that had always been our pattern. Instead, he found open closets, empty drawers, and neatly packed boxes waiting for movers. On the kitchen table rested a single handwritten letter. I explained that respect could never grow where humiliation was accepted. I told him I loved the man he used to be, but I could no longer stay married to the man who watched me suffer in silence. By the time he finished reading those words, Caleb and I were already boarding a flight. Our destination was the small town where my parents lived. They welcomed us without asking difficult questions because they could see the exhaustion on my face. For the first time in years, I slept through the entire night without worrying about the next phone call from Margaret or the next family gathering. Nathan called dozens of times during the first week. When I finally answered, he begged me to come home and insisted everything could be fixed. I quietly asked him one question: where were you when I needed you most? He had no answer. A few weeks later, I officially began divorce proceedings. My attorney encouraged me to save every message and every email from previous years. Reading them again shocked even me. The pattern of manipulation had become impossible to ignore. Friends who had attended earlier family gatherings agreed to provide statements describing how often Margaret publicly insulted me, while Nathan remained silent. The truth that had been hidden behind family traditions was finally impossible to deny. What everyone once dismissed as harmless jokes suddenly looked exactly as it had always been: emotional abuse disguised as family loyalty. During mediation, Nathan looked completely different from the confident man who had given me that terrible ultimatum. He admitted he had spent years trying to keep peace inside his parents' home instead of protecting the family he had created. He apologized without blaming his mother or making excuses for himself. It was the first honest conversation we had shared in a very long time. Although his words were sincere, they arrived after years of broken trust. Some mistakes cannot be erased simply because someone finally understands them. Almost a year has passed since that unforgettable evening. Caleb is now thriving in a peaceful home where laughter no longer depends on someone else's approval. Nathan remains an active father, and I never stand between him and his son because Caleb deserves love from both parents. Margaret still refuses to accept responsibility for what happened, but her influence over Nathan has never been the same. Losing his marriage forced him to recognize the cost of remaining silent for so many years. Looking back, I no longer remember that family dinner as the night my marriage ended. I remember it as the night I finally stopped believing that love required endless sacrifice. Respect is not something a spouse should beg for, and loyalty should never mean accepting humiliation. Nathan told me to apologize or leave because he believed I had nowhere else to go. What he never realized was that the greatest strength I discovered was the courage to quietly walk away. Sometimes karma does not arrive with shouting, revenge, or anger. Sometimes it arrives with a woman who finally chooses herself, takes her child by the hand, and never looks back. The mediation ended with a settlement that allowed Nathan to remain an active father, while Caleb continued living primarily with me. I never wanted revenge, and I never wanted to erase Nathan from our son's life. My only goal had always been to give Caleb a childhood free from constant tension and humiliation. When the paperwork was finally signed, I walked outside feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time since my wedding day, my future belonged to me instead of the expectations of someone else's family. News of the divorce spread quickly through the Brooks family. Relatives who had remained silent for years suddenly began reaching out. Some admitted they had always known Margaret treated me unfairly, but had been too afraid to confront her. Others apologized for laughing at jokes they never found funny. Their messages did not erase the past, but they confirmed something I had questioned for years. I had never imagined the problem. I had simply been the only person willing to acknowledge it. Nathan struggled more than anyone expected. Living alone forced him to face the silence he had spent years avoiding. There were no family dinners to distract him, and no excuses left to hide behind. Every evening he returned to an empty house filled with reminders of the life he had lost. Caleb no longer greeted him at the front door with excited hugs, and the laughter that once filled our home had disappeared. Only then did Nathan truly understand that protecting his parents had cost him the family he loved most. A few months later, another family gathering was planned at Margaret and Thomas' house. According to several relatives, Margaret behaved exactly as she always had. She criticized the food, corrected people's conversations, and demanded everyone follow her rules. But this time something unexpected happened. When she began insulting Nathan's younger cousin in front of everyone, Nathan calmly stood up from his chair. The room fell silent as he looked directly at his mother and told her that the years of humiliation ended that day. He explained that he had already lost his marriage because he stayed silent once before, and he refused to repeat the mistake again. Margaret expected the family to support her, just as they always had. Instead, one by one, several relatives quietly agreed with Nathan. Thomas lowered his head without saying a word, while others admitted they had spent years pretending everything was normal. For the first time in decades, Margaret realized she could no longer control every conversation through fear and criticism. The family gathering ended early, not because of another argument, but because everyone had finally spoken the truth they had hidden for years. Several weeks later, Nathan asked if we could meet after dropping Caleb off at preschool. We sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop where we had celebrated our first anniversary many years earlier. He looked older than I remembered, not because of age, but because regret had changed him. He apologized again, this time without asking for another chance. He admitted that every time he asked me to keep the peace, he had been asking me to sacrifice my dignity for his comfort. Hearing those words brought tears to both our eyes, because they were the words I had waited years to hear. I thanked him for taking responsibility, but I also explained that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. I had forgiven him long before that conversation, because carrying resentment would only hurt me. Returning to the marriage, however, would mean ignoring everything we had learned. Nathan nodded quietly, because he already understood. Sometimes love survives, but trust does not. We left the cafe with mutual respect instead of false hope, committed only to raising Caleb with the kindness both of us wished he had seen during our marriage. As the years passed, Caleb grew into a confident and compassionate young boy. He loved spending time with both of his parents, and we worked hard to ensure he never felt caught between us. Nathan became the father he had always wanted to be, and I genuinely respected the effort he made to change. Although our marriage had ended, our shared love for Caleb remained stronger than any resentment from the past. Looking back now, people often ask whether I regret walking away that night. My answer has never changed. Leaving was the hardest decision I have ever made, but it was also the most important. Staying would have taught my son that love means accepting disrespect. Walking away taught him something far more valuable. Real love is built on trust, respect, and courage. The night my husband told me to apologize or leave, everyone believed I had lost everything. The truth was, that was the night I finally found myself. Sometimes karma is not watching someone else fall. Sometimes karma is finding the strength to stand up, walk away, and build the peaceful life you deserved all along. The truth always finds its way, and karma never forgets. If you enjoyed this story, please support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to Assembly Betrayal Stories. Press the bell icon to stay updated with every new emotional story we upload. I would love to hear your opinion, so leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the story. See you in the next video.